"24.66, she whispered, staring at the coins. 1 penny short. The pharmacist shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, I can't." "Wait." The word escaped Richard's lips before he realized he'd spoken. Both the pharmacist and the young woman turned to look at him, and when her eyes met his, something electric and inexplicable passed between them. "Hello, my dearest family. Before we begin, let us take a moment to lift each other in prayer. Heavenly Lord, please watch over everyone watching this story today, guide their steps, and fill their hearts with love and hope. Amen. Family, you are not just subscribers. You are my strength and my inspiration to keep creating. To those who just joined, welcome home. Kindly subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment and let me know where you are watching from. I would love to meet you. Every story I share is a piece of me, my late nights, my dedication, my heart. When you leave too soon, it feels as though that sacrifice is unseen. Please stay with me until the very end. I love you all deeply. Now, let's begin our story. The elevator climbed 30 floors in silence, each passing number a reminder of how far Richard Hayes had risen from everything that once mattered. Through the glass walls of Morrison Industries, downtown stretched endlessly below, a concrete ocean where millions of lives played out their daily struggles while he floated above it all, untouchable and untouched. "Mr. Hayes." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The quarterly reports are ready for your review, and your son's school called about pickup." David, his 7-year-old boy, who still asked when Mommy was coming home, even though Rebecca had been gone for 2 years. Richard pressed his palm against the cool glass, watching tiny figures move like ants on the sidewalks below. Success meant nothing when you came home to silence. "Reschedule the reports," he said quietly. "I'll get David myself today." The words felt foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he'd picked up his son? Last month? Last quarter? The realization settled like lead in his chest. 20 miles away, in a cramped studio apartment that smelled of instant ramen and determination, Hallie Williams highlighted another passage in her organic chemistry textbook. The yellow marker was running dry. She'd been stretching it for 3 months now, just like everything else in her life. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and she winced, placing her hand on the tight curve of her belly. 8 months along, and still no word from the Hendersons. 3 weeks since their last text. 4 weeks since they'd stopped sending the promised support payments. Her phone buzzed. "Hallie, we need to talk. Can you come by tomorrow?" Jennifer Henderson. A chill ran down her spine. She knew that tone, even through text. Cold. Distant. The same tone Jennifer had used when she'd first approached Hallie at the campus coffee shop, all smiles and promises about helping a deserving young woman pursue her dreams, while solving their fertility problems. Hallie had believed in the fairy tale then. A chemistry major on scholarship, drowning in student debt, offered $50,000 to carry a child for a wealthy couple who couldn't conceive. It had seemed like providence, a way to finish her degree without crushing debt, while helping create the family the Hendersons desperately wanted. Now, staring at the text message, Hallie felt the familiar knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The baby shifted again, as if sensing her anxiety. She had $31.83 in her checking account, and a refrigerator that contained half a loaf of bread, some wilted lettuce, and hope that was growing thinner by the day. Richard's Mercedes pulled into the pharmacy parking lot with precision that matched everything else in his carefully controlled life. David needed his allergy medication refilled, another task that usually fell to the nanny, but Mrs. Chun had called in sick. The automatic doors whooshed open, bringing the familiar scent of antiseptic and artificial vanilla air freshener. He moved through the aisles with purpose, his Italian leather shoes clicking against linoleum that had seen better days. At the pharmacy counter, a young woman stood ahead of him, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Even from behind, Richard could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept touching her swollen belly with protective instinctiveness. "I'm sorry," the pharmacist was saying, his voice carrying that particular tone of rehearsed sympathy. "Your insurance doesn't cover this brand. The generic is still $24.67. The woman, girl, really, she looked barely out of her teens, opened her wallet and began counting coins onto the counter. Quarters, dimes, nickels. The sound seemed to echo in the small space, each coin a small defeat. Richard found himself holding his breath, watching this intimate moment of vulnerability. She was wearing scrubs, hospital scrubs, and her natural hair was pulled back in a style that suggested both pride and practicality. There was something about the careful way she moved, the quiet dignity in her posture despite her obvious struggle, that made him unable to look away. $24.66, she whispered, staring at the coins. 1 penny short. The pharmacist shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, I can't." "Wait." The word escaped Richard's lips before he realized he'd spoken. Both the pharmacist and the young woman turned to look at him, and when her eyes met his, something electric and inexplicable passed between them. She was beautiful, not in the polished way of the women who moved in his social circles, but with a raw, authentic beauty that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. Her dark eyes held intelligence and strength, even as they flickered with embarrassment at being witnessed in this moment. "Please," he said gently, stepping forward. "Let me." Hallie's first instinct was to refuse. Pride warred with necessity as she looked at this man. Clearly wealthy, clearly white, clearly everything she'd learned to be wary of. His suit probably cost more than she'd see in 6 months. But something in his eyes stopped her defensive words before they could form. There was no pity there, no condescension. Just recognition. As if he understood what it meant to stand at a counter, counting coins, hoping they'd be enough. "You don't have to," she started. "I know I don't have to," Richard said quietly, already reaching for his wallet. "But I'd like to, if that's okay." The baby formula transaction took 30 seconds. Richard's black card made the payment effortless, but the moment stretched far longer in both their hearts. As the pharmacist handed Hallie the bag, their fingers brushed, and she felt something she hadn't expected, safety. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than seemed possible. Richard nodded, but as she turned to leave, he found himself speaking again. Are you okay? I mean, do you have everything you need?" Hallie paused at the question, studying his face for signs of the usual motivations. Guilt, superiority, the need to feel good about himself. But all she saw was genuine concern, and it nearly broke her. "I will be," she said simply, then walked away before she could say anything else, leaving Richard standing in the pharmacy with the strangest feeling that his world had just shifted on its axis. Outside, Hallie sat in her 15-year-old Honda, hands trembling as she held the formula. A stranger had just saved her baby from hunger, and she didn't even know his name. Inside, Richard stood frozen, watching through the window as her car pulled away, wondering why helping one struggling mother felt like the most important thing he'd done in years. Neither of them knew that this was only the beginning. 3 days later, Hallie sat across from Jennifer Henderson in a coffee shop that cost more per cup than Hallie usually spent on lunch. The meeting she dreaded was somehow worse than her worst fears. "You have to understand our position," Jennifer said, her manicured fingers wrapped around a $15 latte. "We specifically requested a male child. The contract was very clear about that." Hallie's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby, her baby now apparently, kicked as if sensing the tension. The contract also specified support payments through delivery and medical coverage. You stopped both, because you're not fulfilling your end of the agreement. Jennifer's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never had to count coins for basic necessities. We can't accept a female child. We have specific requirements for our family line. The words hit like physical blows. Hallie had carried this child for 8 months, felt every flutter and kick, talked to her belly during late-night study sessions. Now she was being told the baby was defective goods because she wasn't a boy. So what are you saying? Jennifer slid a document across the table. We're terminating the contract. You can keep the child, obviously, but any financial obligations end today. We've already found another surrogate, one who can guarantee us what we need. Hallie stared at the papers, her vision blurring. 8 months of her life. 8 months of carefully managed nutrition, prenatal vitamins she could barely afford, sacrificing her already limited resources for this baby's health. And now they were discarding both of them like unwanted merchandise. I have nowhere to go, she whispered. My scholarship doesn't cover maternity leave. I'll have to drop out. I'm sorry, but that's not our responsibility anymore. Jennifer stood, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood. You're an intelligent young woman. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Hallie sat alone at the table for 20 minutes after Jennifer left, staring at the termination papers and trying to figure out how she was going to survive. Her savings, what little she'd managed to keep, would last maybe 2 weeks. After that, she couldn't even finish the thought. That evening, Richard sat in his home office, staring at quarterly projections that blurred together into meaningless numbers. David was asleep upstairs, another bedtime story read by the nanny because Daddy had important work to finish. Rebecca's photo still sat on his desk. Beautiful, brilliant Rebecca, who died in a car accident coming home from her shift at the free clinic where she volunteered. She'd spent her last evening caring for people who couldn't afford healthcare, because that's who she was. Someone who saw suffering and acted. The memory of the young woman from the pharmacy kept intruding on his thoughts. Something about her quiet dignity, the way she'd held herself together despite obvious desperation. Rebecca would have helped her without hesitation. Richard closed his laptop and made a decision that surprised himself. The next morning, he found himself back at the same pharmacy, feeling foolish but unable to stay away. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for. Another chance encounter, maybe an opportunity to do more than just buy formula. He was examining cough syrup labels when he heard a commotion near the front of the store. "Ma'am, you're going to have to leave if you can't pay. Please, just give me until tomorrow. I'll have the money tomorrow." Richard looked up to see the same young woman. Hallie, he'd somehow remembered her name from somewhere, standing at the counter with baby formula and prenatal vitamins. Her face was flushed with embarrassment, her hands pressed against her belly in a gesture that seemed both protective and defeated. "Store policy is store policy," the clerk said, not unkindly but firmly. "I can hold the items for 24 hours, but I can't complete the sale without payment." Richard moved without thinking, his feet carrying him toward the counter before his mind could catalogue all the reasons this was complicated. "Excuse me," he said gently, and both the clerk and Hallie turned toward him. When her eyes met his, he saw recognition flicker across her features. Surprise, embarrassment, and something else. Something that made his pulse quicken. "You," she breathed, and the single word carried a universe of meaning. "Me," he confirmed, offering a small smile. "And if I'm not mistaken, you could use a friend right now." Hallie's walls shot up instantly. "I don't need charity." "Good," Richard said, pulling out his phone. Because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a job. A job. Hallie's voice cracked slightly. My son's nanny just gave notice. I need someone immediately. Someone educated, responsible, someone who understands children. He gestured toward her belly. Someone who's about to understand them even better. The clerk watched this exchange with barely concealed fascination. Richard handed over his card for Hallie's items without breaking eye contact. You don't even know me, Hallie said, but her voice held less conviction now. I know you're counting coins to feed a baby that isn't even yours yet. I know you're in scrubs, which means you work in healthcare. I know you carry yourself like someone who's educated and responsible. Richard's voice was gaining confidence. And I know that 3 days ago, you thanked me like someone who still believes in human decency, despite the world giving you every reason not to. Hallie felt tears threatening. The kindness was almost harder to bear than the cruelty. Why would you help a stranger? Because strangers don't stay strangers if you give them a chance. The words surprised Richard as much as they did Hallie. And because my son needs stability, and you need security. Sometimes solutions find each other. The stress of the conversation, the relief of unexpected help, and the weight of everything she'd been carrying suddenly overwhelmed Hallie. The room spun slightly, and she gripped the counter for support. Hey, Richard said, immediately stepping closer. Hey, are you okay? Hallie's knees buckled slightly, and without thinking, Richard caught her elbow, steadying her. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through both of them. Something electric and entirely inappropriate for strangers in a pharmacy. When's the last time you ate? He asked, his voice filled with concern that seemed to surprise them both. Yesterday. Maybe. The admission felt like another small defeat. Okay, that's stopping right now. Richard's tone shifted to something gentle, but non-negotiable. We're getting you food, and then we're talking about this job offer properly. As Richard helped her toward the door, Hallie found herself studying his profile. There was something familiar about his kindness, something that felt like coming home to a place she'd never been. Your wife, she said suddenly. She was black, wasn't she? Richard stopped walking, his face cycling through surprise, pain, and something like wonder. How did you? The way you look at me. Like you're seeing someone else too. Hallie's voice was soft, understanding. Like this matters to you in a way that goes deeper than charity. They stood in the pharmacy entrance, people moving around them, and Richard felt the careful walls he'd built around his grief beginning to crumble. Rebecca, he said quietly. She died 2 years ago. Car accident coming home from the free clinic where she volunteered. He looked at Hallie with new vulnerability. She would have helped you without hesitation. She would have seen exactly what I'm seeing. Which is someone worth knowing, Richard said, and the simple honesty of it made Hallie's breath catch. They found themselves in a small diner 3 blocks away, Richard watching with quiet satisfaction as Hallie ate her first real meal in days. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward. 2 damaged people taking the measure of each other. The baby, Richard said finally. If you don't mind me asking. Hallie set down her fork, her hand moving to her belly. Surrogacy contract. The Hendersons, wealthy couple who couldn't conceive. They offered me $50,000 to carry their child. Her laugh was bitter. $50,000 that was going to change my life. Let me finish my chemistry degree without drowning in debt. What happened? They wanted a boy. For their family legacy. Hallie's voice hardened. When the ultrasound showed a girl, they decided I wasn't fulfilling my contract. Cut off support, stopped returning calls. Their lawyer says they owe me nothing because I didn't deliver what they ordered. Richard felt anger flare in his chest, clean, protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. They can't just abandon you. Turns out they can. Turns out when you're a 20-year-old black woman carrying someone else's child, you have fewer rights than you think. Hallie met his eyes. So now I'm 8 months pregnant with a daughter no one wants, about to lose my scholarship, with nowhere to go and no way to support us. The word us hung in the air between them. Not me and the baby. Us. As if they were already family. What's her name? Richard asked softly. Hallie's eyes filled. Hope. I started calling her Hope 3 months ago, when things got bad. Because some days, hope is all we have. Richard reached across the table and covered her hand with his. A gesture so natural it shocked them both. The contact sent warmth shooting up Hallie's arm and straight to her heart. Hope has a family now, he said firmly. Both of you do. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither of them was prepared for. Hallie stared at their joined hands, his pale fingers gentle against her darker skin, and felt her world shift again. You don't know me, she whispered, but she didn't pull away. I know enough, Richard said. I know you're brave enough to sacrifice for a child that isn't yours. I know you're strong enough to pursue an education while carrying that child. I know you're proud enough to count coins rather than ask for help. His thumb traced across her knuckles. And I know that for the first time in 2 years, I want to know everything else. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Hallie felt her heart racing, not from the baby, but from the way this man was looking at her. Like she was precious, like she was worth protecting, like she was worth loving. This is crazy, she breathed. Completely insane, Richard agreed, but his hand didn't move from hers. Outside, the city moved at its relentless pace, but inside the small diner, time seemed suspended as two broken hearts recognized something in each other that neither had expected to find. The baby kicked against Hallie's ribs again, and this time she smiled. Hope seems to approve, she said softly. Richard smiled back, the first real smile he'd worn since Rebecca died. Smart kid, he said. Must get it from her mother. The word mother settled between them like a promise, and both of them knew that nothing would ever be the same. Before we continue the story, kindly make sure you have clicked on the subscribe button. This motivates me to bring you more beautiful stories like this. Now let's continue. The next morning hit Hallie like cold water. Sitting in her studio apartment, staring at Richard's business card, the previous day felt like a fever dream. A millionaire CEO offering her a job, holding her hand in a diner. The rational part of her mind, the part that had earned her a 3.8 GPA, was screaming warnings. This doesn't happen to girls like you, her mother's voice echoed in her head. Rich white men don't save poor black girls out of kindness. They want something. Hallie touched her belly, where Hope was doing what felt like morning gymnastics. What do you think, baby girl? Is Mama losing her mind? Her phone buzzed. Good morning. I hope you slept well. Would you like to see the position details today? Richard. The formality of the text felt safer than the intensity of yesterday's connection. Maybe she'd imagined the electricity between them. Maybe he was just a decent man trying to help, and her hormones and desperation had created feelings that weren't real. She typed back, yes, thank you. When would be convenient? Now, if possible. David's school has a half day, and you could meet him. Hallie stared at the message. Meeting his child felt enormous, like crossing a line from stranger to something more significant. But she needed this job. She needed security for Hope. Address? Meanwhile, Richard paced his office like a caged animal, second-guessing everything. What was he doing? Offering a job to a woman he'd met buying baby formula? His board would think he'd lost his mind. Hell, maybe he had. But every time he tried to talk himself out of it, He remembered the grace with which she'd counted those coins, the strength in her voice when she'd said, "I will be," the way his heart had jumped when she'd smiled. His assistant knocked. "Mr. Hayes? Your 10 o'clock is here." "Cancel it," Richard said without thinking. "Sir, cancel everything today. I have something more important to handle." 20 minutes later, Richard stood in his living room, watching David play with building blocks, and wondering how to explain that a virtual stranger might become part of their lives. David looked up with Rebecca's eyes, dark, intelligent, curious. "Daddy, you're home early again." "I am. Listen, buddy, someone special is coming to meet us today. A lady who might help take care of you while Daddy's at work." David's face fell. "Is Mrs. Chen not coming back?" The question hit harder than it should have. Mrs. Chun was David's stability, his constant. Now Richard was potentially disrupting that for what? A woman he barely knew? A feeling he couldn't explain? "Mrs. Chun is just retiring, remember? This lady is different. Her name is Hallie. Is she nice like Mommy was?" The innocent question stopped Richard's breath. David rarely talked about Rebecca directly anymore, and hearing him make the comparison felt like a sign, or a warning. "I think she might be, yes." The doorbell rang before Richard could second-guess himself further. Through the security camera, he watched Hallie smooth her dress. A simple blue maternity dress that somehow made her look both professional and radiant. She'd done something different with her hair, and even through the grainy camera feed, he could see she was nervous. Richard opened the door, and the impact of seeing her again nearly knocked him backward. If anything, she was more beautiful than he remembered. Her skin glowing with pregnancy, her eyes bright with intelligence and determination. "Hi," she said simply. "Hi yourself." The response came out warmer than professional, and they both felt the current between them immediately. David appeared at Richard's side, studying Hallie with the intense focus only children could manage. "Are you going to have a baby?" Hallie smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Richard had seen from her. "I am. A little girl." "I like girls," David announced. Mommy was a girl, and she was the best person ever. The casual mention of his mother made Richard tense, but Hallie knelt down, carefully, given her belly, to meet David at eye level. "Your mommy sounds wonderful," she said gently. "What was the best thing about her?" "She made voices for all my stuffed animals. And she smelled like flowers. And she never got mad when I spilled things." Richard watched Hallie's face soften as she listened to David, and something dangerous bloomed in his chest. This felt right in a way that terrified him. "Mr. Hayes." Hallie stood, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Perhaps we should discuss the position details." The formal tone felt wrong after yesterday's connection, but Richard recognized it as necessary armor. "Of course. David, why don't you show Miss Hallie your room while I get us some drinks?" As David led Hallie upstairs, chattering about his toy collection, Richard's phone rang. His mother's contact photo flashed on the screen. A reminder of the world beyond this house, the expectations and judgments waiting outside. "Richard, darling, I heard from Patricia Morrison that you've been acting strangely. Missing meetings?" "Hello, Mother." Richard's voice automatically shifted to the careful tone his upbringing demanded. "I hope you're not having another episode. David needs stability, not whatever midlife crisis." "I'm fine, Mother." "Good. Because I've arranged for you to meet the daughter of the Thompson family next week. Sarah Thompson. Lovely girl, excellent breeding, perfect for David's development." Richard closed his eyes. The world his mother inhabited, the world he'd grown up in, had rules about who belonged with whom. Rules that wouldn't include a pregnant 20-year-old, no matter how extraordinary she was. Upstairs, Hallie was having her own moment of clarity. David's room was bigger than her entire apartment. The toys scattered across the floor cost more than her monthly expenses. The gulf between her world and Richard's felt oceanic. "Do you like my daddy?" David asked with characteristic childhood directness. The question caught Hallie off guard. I don't know your daddy very well yet." "He's sad a lot," David said matter-of-factly, "since Mommy died. But yesterday he smiled at dinner. I think it's because he met you." When they reconvened in the living room, the tension was palpable. Richard set down coffee cups with careful precision, and Hallie sat with her hands folded, both of them suddenly aware of the impossibility of their situation. "The position," Richard began carefully, "would include housing in the staff quarters, health insurance, and a salary of—" "Staff quarters." Hallie's voice was quiet but sharp. Richard paused. "There's a small apartment above the garage. Private entrance, fully furnished. Where the help lives," Hallie finished, and the word help landed like a slap. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" Hallie stood, her dignity wrapped around her like armor. "Yesterday you held my hand in a diner and made me feel like I mattered. Today you're offering me quarters above your garage." Richard felt panic rising in his chest. "Hallie, you what?" Felt sorry for the poor pregnant girl and decided to throw some money at the problem. Her eyes flashed with hurt and anger. "I may be desperate, Mr. Hayes, but I'm not charity." "That's not." Richard stood too, stepping closer. "Yesterday wasn't about charity. Yesterday was..." "Was what?" The question hung between them, loaded with everything they couldn't say. Richard looked at this fierce, beautiful woman carrying another family's abandoned child, and felt his carefully ordered world tilting completely off its axis. "Yesterday was the first time in 2 years that I felt alive," he admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep. "And that terrifies me." Hallie stared at him, seeing past his wealth and privilege to the raw pain underneath. Here was a man who'd lost everything that mattered, trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage. "You think this is just about the money?" she asked softly. "You think I don't feel it too?" Richard's breath caught. "Hallie, I've been taking care of myself since I was 16. Working 2 jobs, full scholarship, top of my class. I've never needed saving." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. "But yesterday, when you looked at me like I was worth something, like I was someone who deserved kindness, I felt something I've never felt before." "What?" "Like maybe I don't have to carry everything alone." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and raw and dangerous. David, who'd been quietly playing with blocks, looked up at both adults. "Are you fighting?" "No, sweetheart," Hallie said gently, her anger dissolving as she looked at the little boy. "Sometimes grown-ups have to figure out complicated feelings. Like when I want to be mad at Tommy, but I also want to be his friend. Exactly like that." Richard watched Hallie with David and felt something click into place. Not just attraction, but recognition. She belonged here, in this house, in their lives, in ways that had nothing to do with employment, and everything to do with the family they could become. "I can't take the job," Hallie said finally, turning back to Richard. "Not because of pride, but because what I'm feeling for you isn't professional. And that's not fair to you, or to David, or to Hope." "What if I don't want professional?" The question escaped before Richard could stop it. Hallie's eyes widened. "Richard, what if I want impossible? What if I want complicated?" He stepped closer, close enough to see gold flecks in her brown eyes. "What if yesterday wasn't just kindness but recognition? What if we're both brave enough to see where this leads? People will say. Let them say it." Richard's voice was firm. "My wife taught me that love doesn't ask permission from society. It just shows up and demands you choose it." Hallie felt tears threatening again, but these were different. tears of possibility rather than despair. I'm carrying someone else's child, she whispered. And I'm raising someone else's memory, Richard replied. Maybe we're both ready for something that belongs to us. The moment stretched between them, fragile and enormous. David continued building his tower of blocks, oblivious to the fact that two adults were standing in his living room, falling in love against all logic and social expectation. This is insane, Hallie breathed. Completely, Richard agreed, taking another step closer. So what do you say we be insane together? Hope kicked hard against Hallie's ribs, and this time Hallie laughed, a sound of pure joy that made Richard's heart soar. I think Hope just voted yes, she said. Smart girl, Richard murmured, and when Hallie looked up at him, both of them knew they were about to cross a line that would change everything. The resistance was crumbling, but the real tests were just beginning. The storm hit without warning, one of those late spring tempests that turned the sky black and sent everyone scrambling for shelter. Hallie had been about to leave Richard's house when the first crack of thunder made David jump into her arms with surprising trust. Nobody drives in this, Richard said, watching sheets of rain assault the windows. The news is saying flash flooding on all the main roads. Hallie looked at her phone. 17 missed calls from her landlord, for texts about overdue rent, and a weather alert warning against travel. The universe seemed determined to keep her here, in this warm house that smelled like expensive coffee and the kind of security she'd never known. I could call a cab when it passes, she offered half-heartedly. In this, Richard gestured toward the windows where lightning was turning the afternoon into a strobe light. Absolutely not. You're staying until it's safe. The declaration felt more personal than practical, and they both knew it. David, still clinging to Hallie, looked up with wide eyes. Are you scared of storms too? A little, Hallie admitted, settling onto the couch with him. But storms don't last forever. They just make the sunshine feel better when it comes back. That's what Mommy used to say, David whispered, and the room grew quiet except for the rain against glass. Richard felt his chest tighten, watching them together. David hadn't voluntarily touched anyone except Mrs. Chun since Rebecca died. But here he was, cuddled against Hallie like he'd known her forever. And Hallie, she was stroking David's hair with the same gentle motion she used when touching her belly, as if nurturing came naturally to her. Are you hungry? Richard asked, needing something to do with his hands, some way to channel the energy building between them. I could make dinner. You cook? Hallie's eyebrows rose in surprise. Rebecca taught me. Said I couldn't survive on takeout forever. The mention of his wife's name felt different this time. Less like a wall and more like a bridge. Nothing fancy, but I can manage pasta. They moved to the kitchen together, David trailing behind with a book. The space felt intimate in a way that had nothing to do with its size, and everything to do with the way they naturally fell into rhythm. Richard chopping vegetables while Hallie stirred sauce, both of them hyper-aware of every accidental brush of hands, every shared glance. Tell me about school, Richard said as they worked. What made you choose chemistry? Hallie smiled, her guard dropping. My grandmother. She cleaned houses for wealthy families her whole life, but she had this brilliance. Always mixing things, creating solutions. Homemade cleaners that worked better than store-bought. Remedies for everything. Her voice grew wistful. She used to say, "Baby girl, the world tries to tell us we can't create anything that matters, but chemistry don't lie. Elements want a bond, and smart people figure out how to help them." She sounds incredible. She was. Died when I was 17, just before I started college. Hallie's hand moved to her belly. I wanted to be someone who creates things that help people. Pharmaceuticals, maybe, or environmental solutions. something that makes the world better. Richard stopped chopping, struck by the passion in her voice. Here was someone who understood that success meant more than accumulation. It meant contribution. You still can, he said firmly. This doesn't have to end your dreams. Doesn't it? Hallie's laugh held no humor. Single mother with no support, no family, carrying someone else's rejected child? The chemistry department isn't exactly designed for people like me. Then we make it work for people like you. The casual, we made Hallie's heart skip. We. Richard met her eyes across the kitchen island. I meant what I said yesterday. About this being bigger than a job. David had fallen asleep on the living room rug, his book spread across his chest. Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, and inside, Richard and Hallie found themselves alone in a way that felt both dangerous and inevitable. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between them charged with unspoken possibility. Richard had changed into jeans and a sweater, casual clothes that made him look younger, more approachable, less like the CEO who could buy and sell her world. Can I ask you something? Hallie said, curling her legs under her. Anything. Yesterday, when you saw me at that counter, what did you really see? Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight. Honestly, please. I saw someone fighting for something that mattered to her. Someone who wouldn't give up even when the world was stacked against her. He paused. I saw the kind of person Rebecca was. The kind of person I used to be, before I got lost in boardrooms and profit margins. And what do you see now? Richard's gaze traveled over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Now I see someone who makes me remember what it feels like to want something more than success. The words hung between them, loaded with implication. Hallie felt her walls crumbling piece by piece. Richard. She started, but he held up a hand. I know this is complicated. I know we barely know each other. I know there are 100 reasons why this is a terrible idea. His voice dropped lower. But I also know that I've spent 2 years feeling nothing, and 3 days feeling everything, and I'm not ready to go back to nothing. Hope chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, making Hallie gasp and press her hand to her side. Without thinking, Richard moved closer. Is she okay? Are you okay? She's just active tonight. Hallie smiled despite the discomfort. She gets restless during storms too, apparently. May I? Richard's hand hovered near her belly, and the question carried more weight than just asking to feel a baby kick. Hallie nodded, and when Richard's palm settled against the curve where Hope was moving, the intimacy of the moment took both their breaths away. The baby kicked directly against his hand, and Richard's face lit up with wonder. She's so strong, he whispered. She has to be, Hallie said softly. The world's not going to be easy for her. It will be if I have anything to say about it. The fierce protectiveness in Richard's voice surprised them both. Their faces were close now, close enough for Hallie to see the gold flecks in his green eyes, close enough for Richard to see the trust warring with fear in her expression. I don't know how to do this, Hallie whispered. I don't know how to let someone take care of me. I don't know how to do this either, Richard admitted. I don't know how to open my heart again without being terrified it'll get broken. So we figure it out together? Together, Richard agreed, and slowly, carefully, he cupped her face with his free hand. They were a breath away from kissing when David stirred on the rug, mumbling something in his sleep. The moment shattered, and both adults pulled back, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what they were considering. I should. Hallie started to stand, but Richard caught her hand. Don't run because this feels big. It feels impossible, she countered, but she didn't pull away. Most good things do at first. They sat in the lamp-lit living room, Richard's hand covering hers, listening to David's quiet breathing and the storm outside, both of them teetering on the edge of something that could destroy them or save them. "I'm scared," Hallie admitted. "Me too," Richard said. "But I'm more scared of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering, what if?" Hope kicked again, stronger this time, and Hallie laughed despite her tears. "I think someone else has an opinion about this," she said. Richard's thumb traced across her knuckles, and when he looked at her, his eyes held a promise that made her heart race. "Then maybe we should listen to her." Outside, the storm began to quiet, but inside, something much more powerful was just beginning to build. Sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards. Have you ever had to choose between safety and the possibility of something amazing? Tell us about a time you took a leap of faith in the comments below. The evening stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and danger, and neither of them was ready for it to end. They were about to discover that some forces, like love, like destiny, like hope itself, couldn't be resisted forever. They were falling, and for the first time in years, both of them were ready to trust the landing. The storm had passed by midnight, but neither Richard nor Hallie had mentioned leaving. David was tucked into his bed, and they found themselves in Richard's study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the ghosts of conversations that mattered. "Tell me about Rebecca," Hallie said softly, curled in the leather armchair with a cup of tea Richard had made her. "If it's not too hard." Richard was quiet for so long that Hallie thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of grief carefully held. "We met at Northwestern. She was pre-med, I was business. Complete opposites." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "She used to say I was too focused on building empires, while she wanted to heal the casualties they left behind. But you fell in love anyway. She made me better, made me see beyond profit margins to actual impact. When David was born," Richard's voice caught slightly, "she said he was proof that love could create something perfect in an imperfect world." Hallie felt tears threatening. "She sounds extraordinary." "She was. And she would have loved you, would have seen exactly what I see." Richard looked at Hallie with an intensity that made her heart race. Someone fighting for something bigger than herself. Someone who turned struggle into strength. The words settled between them like a benediction, but Hallie felt the familiar weight of secrets pressing against her chest. "Richard, there's something about me, about my situation that you don't understand. Then help me understand." Hallie set down her tea with trembling hands. "The Hendersons didn't just abandon me because they wanted a boy. They abandoned me because—" She took a shaking breath. "Because they found out about my mother." Richard waited, sensing she was about to share something that cost her everything to reveal. "My mother is in prison. Has been since I was 16. Drug trafficking." The words came out flat, defensive. "The Hendersons hired a private investigator when I was 7 months along. Said they couldn't risk their child being raised by someone with criminal genetics." Richard felt anger flare hot in his chest. "That's not how genetics work, and it's definitely not how character works. Tell that to them. Tell that to the scholarship committee who'll review my case when they find out. Tell that to everyone who'll look at me and see exactly what they expect to see." Hallie's voice was getting stronger, but Richard could hear the pain underneath. A poor black girl from a bad family making predictable choices. "Look at me," Richard said firmly, and when she did, his eyes were blazing. "I see a woman who worked 2 jobs to put herself through school. I see someone who sacrificed her body and health to help a family she thought deserved a child. I see someone who counts coins for baby formula and still says thank you with grace." His voice dropped to something fierce and tender. "I see someone extraordinary who's been told she's ordinary so many times she almost believes it." Hallie felt something break open in her chest. Not breaking apart, but breaking open like dawn. There's more. Tell me. The baby. Hope. She's not just some contract I'm fulfilling. Hallie's hand moved to her belly. Somewhere around month 5, when the Hendersons started getting cold, when they began treating me like an incubator instead of a person, I started loving her. Completely. Fiercely. Richard moved closer, settling on the coffee table in front of her chair. Of course you did. You don't understand. I was supposed to be detached. Professional. But every kick, every hiccup, every time she responds to my voice. Hallie's tears started falling freely now. She became mine. Not legally, not according to any contract, but here. She pressed her hand to her heart. She became my daughter. She is your daughter, Richard said with absolute conviction. Biology doesn't make family. Love does. The Hendersons' lawyer says they could still take her. Even after abandoning us, they could change their minds and claim parental rights because of the original contract. The fear in her voice made Richard's protective instincts surge. Over my dead body. The fierceness of his response surprised them both. Hallie studied his face, seeing something she'd missed before. There's something you're not telling me too, she said gently. Richard ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of vulnerability she was learning to recognize. Rebecca and we tried for years to have another child after David. 3 miscarriages. The last one nearly killed her, and the doctors said. He stopped, the memory still sharp after all this time. She blamed herself. Said she was broken. That David was a miracle we didn't deserve to repeat. I spent 2 years watching the most vibrant woman I'd ever known slowly fade away, convinced she was a failure as a mother because her body couldn't carry another child. Hallie's heart ached for him, for the wife who'd tortured herself with impossible standards. When the accident happened, Richard continued, part of me was almost relieved. She was finally free from the pain of feeling inadequate. His voice cracked. And I've hated myself for that thought every day since. Richard, so when I see you, carrying a child with such love and strength, abandoned by people who should be grateful for your sacrifice, it makes me furious. And it makes me want to protect you both with everything I have. They sat in the quiet study, rain pattering against windows, 2 damaged souls recognizing the healing they could offer each other. David's breathing was audible through the baby monitor, steady and peaceful. Can I tell you something that might sound crazy? Hallie asked. After the last 3 days, I'm ready for crazy. Yesterday, when you touched my hand in that diner, Hope went completely still. She's been restless and active for months, but the moment you touched me, she just settled, like she was waiting for you. Richard felt his throat tighten. Rebecca used to say babies could sense good people, that they knew who would protect them. And tonight, when you put your hand on my belly, Hallie smiled through her tears. She's been calm ever since. Content. Like she knows she's safe now. She is safe. You both are. The promise hung between them, enormous in its implications. Tell me about your dreams, Richard said softly. The ones beyond just surviving. Hallie leaned back in the chair, her hand resting on her belly, where Hope slept peacefully. I want to develop medications that poor communities can afford. My grandmother died because she couldn't pay for her diabetes medication, had to choose between rent and insulin. Her voice gained strength. I want Hope to grow up in a world where that choice doesn't exist. What would you need to make that happen? Time to finish my degree. Resources for research. A stable foundation to build from. Hallie met his eyes. Things that seemed impossible 3 days ago. And now I'm sitting in a millionaire's study, being asked about my dreams instead of my limitations. Now impossible feels more like postponed. Richard felt something shift in his chest. Not just attraction, but admiration. Here was someone whose ambitions extended beyond herself, who wanted to use success to lift others. "What about you?" Hallie asked. "What did you dream about before you became a CEO?" "Honestly, I wanted to build affordable housing. Sounds naive now, but I thought wealth should create opportunity, not just accumulate." Richard's smile was rueful. "Rebecca never let me forget that dream. Said Morrison Industries could do more than just make money. It could make change." "What stopped you?" "Fear, mostly. Fear that changing course would risk David's security. Fear that I wasn't smart enough or strong enough to honor Rebecca's vision." He looked at Hallie directly. "Fear that I didn't deserve to build something meaningful." Hope stirred in Hallie's belly, and she winced slightly, shifting in the chair. Richard was beside her instantly, his hands gentle as he helped her adjust position. "She's getting bigger," Hallie murmured. "Running out of room in there." "When are you due?" "4 weeks. Maybe 5. The reality hit her as she said it. "I'll be giving birth to my daughter in a month, and I have nowhere to take her home to." Richard's hands were still on her shoulders, steadying her, and the contact felt electric and essential all at once. "You have somewhere," he said quietly. "If you want it." "Richard, we can't base life decisions on 3 days of..." "Of what?" "Of feeling more connected to someone than I have in 2 years. Of watching you with my son and seeing the mother he needs. Of imagining a future that actually makes me want to wake up tomorrow." His intensity took her breath away. "This is happening so fast. Is it? Or has it been building our whole lives, and we just found each other?" Richard's hands moved to cup her face gently. "I know this defies logic. I know society will have opinions. I know we're both terrified. Then why does it feel so right? Because sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind hasn't figured out yet." They were close now, closer than professional, closer than careful. Hope kicked against Hallie's ribs, and both of them laughed softly at the perfect timing. "She approves," Hallie whispered. "Smart girl," Richard murmured, and this time, when he leaned forward, Hallie didn't pull away. Their first kiss was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. But when Hallie kissed him back, it became an answer that neither of them had known they were looking for. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads touching. "This changes everything," Hallie whispered. "Good," Richard said firmly. Everything needed changing. Outside, the storm was finally passing, but inside Richard's study, something much more powerful had just begun. 2 hearts that had been broken in different ways were discovering they could heal each other, and a baby girl, not yet born, was bringing together the family she'd always been meant to have. The backstory had been unveiled, the wounds exposed and tended. Now came the test of whether their newfound connection could survive the world's attempts to tear it apart. But for tonight, in the lamplight, with Hope dancing between them and David sleeping peacefully nearby, love felt not just possible but inevitable. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and surreal. Hallie had officially moved into the guest room. Not the staff quarters, Richard had insisted, but the elegant suite down the hall from David's room. Every morning she woke to the scent of coffee and the sound of David's laughter drifting up from the kitchen. Richard had taken to working from home more often, claiming he needed to oversee the transition period. But Hallie caught him watching her with an expression that had nothing to do with employment, and everything to do with the way she hummed while making David breakfast, the way she helped with homework without making him feel inadequate, the way she bloomed in the safety he provided. "Miss Hallie," David said on a Tuesday morning, looking up from his cereal, "when Hope is born, will she live here too?" The question hung in the morning air, like sunshine through kitchen windows. Hallie glanced at Richard, whose coffee cup had frozen halfway to his lips. We're still figuring that out, sweetie, Hallie said carefully. I hope she does, David announced with the simple honesty of childhood. She could share my toys. And you could both stay forever. Richard's eyes met Hallie's across the kitchen island, and the longing there made her breath catch. The word forever seemed to echo in the space between them, dangerous and beautiful. That afternoon, while David was at school, Richard found Hallie in the library, surrounded by chemistry textbooks she'd retrieved from her apartment. She was lying on the couch with books balanced on her belly, Hope apparently serving as a study table. Comfortable? Richard asked, settling into the chair beside her. She seems to like helping with homework, Hallie smiled, placing her hand where the baby was pushing against a particularly thick organic chemistry text. Future scientist, maybe. Takes after her mother. The casual claim of motherhood made Hallie's eyes fill. You say that like it's real. Like she's really mine to keep. She is real. This is real. Richard moved to sit on the edge of the couch, his hand finding hers. The lawyer I consulted says the abandonment clause in surrogacy contracts is ironclad. They can't take her back after terminating support. Hallie sat up carefully, hope and fear warring in her expression. You consulted a lawyer? I consulted 5 lawyers. All the best family law attorneys in the state. Richard's voice was fierce with protectiveness. Hope is legally yours, morally yours, and if anyone tries to take her, they'll have to go through me first. The promise hit Hallie like a physical force. No one had ever fought for her before. Not like this, not with resources and determination and absolute conviction. Why? She whispered. Why would you do that for us? Richard's answer was to lean forward and kiss her, soft and sure and full of everything he couldn't yet say out loud. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. Because I'm falling in love with both of you, he said simply. Because David lights up when you're around. Because this house has been a museum for 2 years, and now it feels like a home. That evening, they established a new routine. David insisted on helping Hallie with her baby homework, which consisted of reading pregnancy books and assembling the crib Richard had ordered without asking permission. The book says babies can hear music in the womb, David announced, holding up Hallie's pregnancy guide. Should we play music for Hope? That's a wonderful idea, Hallie said, watching Richard's face as David used the name she'd chosen without hesitation. Richard disappeared and returned with a sound system, and soon the living room was filled with soft classical music. David sat beside Hallie on the couch, his small hand resting next to hers on her belly. Can she hear us talking too? David asked. The book says she can. David leaned closer to Hallie's belly and spoke in a stage whisper that made both adults smile. Hi Hope. I'm David. I'm going to be your big brother, okay? I'll teach you about dinosaurs and how to ride bikes and why vegetables aren't actually poison even though they taste weird. Richard watched his son, the boy who'd been withdrawn and serious for 2 years, chattering excitedly to an unborn baby, and felt pieces of his broken world clicking back together. She kicked, David exclaimed as Hope responded to his voice. She likes me. Of course she does, Hallie laughed. You're going to be the best big brother ever. Richard caught the easy way she said going to be, as if their future together was settled fact rather than tentative hope. The assumption made his heart soar and terrify him in equal measure. Later, after David was asleep, Richard and Hallie found themselves on the back deck, looking out at the garden Rebecca had planted years ago. The night air was soft with spring promises, and Hope was doing her evening dance routine. Can I ask you something personal? Richard said, his voice careful. We're a little past formal boundaries, Hallie smiled. The surrogacy, was it really just financial? Or was there something else? Hallie was quiet for a long moment, her hands moving in slow circles on her belly. You want the truth? Always. I was curious about pregnancy, about carrying life. Her voice grew distant, remembering. My mother was high during most of her pregnancy with me. I always wondered what it would feel like to do it right, to give a baby the best possible start. The money was important, but... She paused. I wanted to experience creating something perfect. And it's been the most beautiful, most terrifying, most overwhelming thing I've ever experienced. Even when the Hendersons turned cold, even when I started struggling financially, I never regretted it. Because hope. She smiled, the expression radiant in the moonlight. Hope made me understand what love really means. Richard felt his chest tighten with emotion. She's lucky to have you. Is she? Single mother, no family, uncertain future. She has a mother who chose to love her when everyone else walked away. She has a mother who fights for her future instead of just surviving her present. Richard moved closer on the bench they shared. She has a mother who's brave enough to build a new life from scratch. Hope chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, and Hallie gasped, her hand flying to her side. She's getting stronger, Richard observed, his hand automatically moving to cover hers on her belly. Too strong sometimes. She's going to be a force of nature. Like her mother. They sat in comfortable silence, both their hands on Hallie's belly, feeling hope move beneath their palms. The intimacy of the moment felt more profound than the kiss they'd shared, more binding than any ceremony. Richard, Hallie said softly, what are we doing? Building something, he replied without hesitation. Something that doesn't exist in any manual or social blueprint, but something that feels more real than anything I've had in years. Your family, your board, society, they're not going to understand this. My family doesn't get a vote in my happiness. My board answers to me, not the other way around. And society. Richard's smile was fierce in the darkness. Society told Rebecca and me we couldn't work either. Different backgrounds, different goals. We proved them wrong then. This is different. I'm different. Yes, Richard agreed, surprising her. You're stronger than Rebecca was. More independent. More willing to fight for what matters. His thumb traced across her knuckles. Different doesn't mean lesser, Hallie. It means exactly what I need. Hope delivered another kick, this one strong enough to make Hallie's shirt move visibly. Both of them laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet garden. She's going to keep us on our toes, Hallie said. Good. We need someone to keep us honest. Richard turned to face her fully. Hallie, I want you to know something. Whatever happens with us, whether this works or crashes and burns, hope will always have a place here. You both will. That's not dependent on romance or employment or anything else. That's just truth. Hallie felt tears threatening again. You can't promise that. I can and I am. Because some things matter more than convenience or convention. Richard's voice was steady, certain. Some things are worth protecting, no matter what it costs. David's voice carried through the baby monitor. Daddy? Miss Hallie? I had a bad dream. They looked at each other and smiled. The moment of profound connection temporarily paused for the practical needs of childhood. Coming, buddy, Richard called, then helped Hallie to her feet. As they walked back toward the house together, toward David who needed comfort, toward the life they were carefully building, Hallie felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt like she belonged. But belonging, she was about to learn, came with its own dangers. Some people would rather see love fail than succeed when it challenged their view of how the world should work. The bonding was real, the connection deepening by the day. But the forces that would try to tear them apart were gathering strength, and the hardest tests were still ahead. For now, though, there was David's nightmare to soothe, Hope's restless energy to calm, and the growing certainty that love, real, complicated, impossible love, was taking root in the most unlikely soil. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier in an envelope that bore the letterhead of Morrison Industries' board of directors. Richard found it on his desk when he returned from taking David to school, a task that had become precious routine in the 3 weeks since Hallie had transformed their lives. The image was crystal clear. Richard and Hallie at the farmer's market the previous Saturday, his hand on the small of her back as she laughed at something David had said. They looked like a family. They looked happy. They looked like everything his world would never accept. The note beneath was typed on expensive stationery. Richard, the board has concerns about your recent associations. A pregnant woman of questionable background living in your home raises serious questions about your judgment and the company's reputation. We strongly suggest you reconsider this arrangement before it becomes a public relations nightmare. Your reputation affects us all. Charles Morrison, Chairman. Richard crumpled the note with hands that shook with rage. But before he could process the violation, his phone rang. Mr. Hayes. His assistant's voice was strained. There's a woman here to see Miss Williams. She says it's urgent. What kind of woman? Jennifer Henderson, sir. She seems upset. Richard's blood went cold. He'd been so focused on protecting Hallie from judgment that he'd forgotten about the legal vultures still circling Hope. Hallie was in the nursery they'd been setting up together, painting walls a soft yellow while Hope kicked her approval, when Richard found her. We have a problem, he said, and something in his tone made her set down the paintbrush immediately. What kind of problem? The Hendersons are here. Hallie felt the bottom drop out of her world. She'd been living in a bubble of safety and possibility, almost forgetting that legal threats still lurked outside Richard's protection. They can't take her, she said, her hands flying protectively to her belly. They can't and they won't, Richard said firmly, but Hallie caught the worry he was trying to hide. They found Jennifer Henderson in the living room, her designer suit and cold smile completely at odds with the warm family space Hallie had helped create. She stood when they entered, her gaze sweeping over Hallie's paint-stained clothes and settling on her belly with predatory calculation. Hallie, you look well cared for. Mrs. Henderson. Hallie's voice was steady, but Richard could see her hands trembling. I thought our business was concluded. Actually, it's not. Jennifer's smile sharpened. We've reconsidered our position. Recent developments have made us realize we may have been hasty. Recent developments. Richard stepped closer to Hallie, his presence protective and possessive. Jennifer's gaze shifted to Richard, taking in his obvious wealth, the elegant home, the way he stood guard over Hallie. It seems our surrogate has found herself a rather advantageous situation. What exactly are you implying? Richard's voice carried the edge of someone used to power. I'm stating facts, Mr. Hayes. Richard Hayes. Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, recognition, calculation. Hayes. As in Morrison Industries Hayes. The same. How interesting. Jennifer's smile turned vicious. So Hallie has managed to trap herself a millionaire. How remarkably convenient. Watch your mouth, Richard warned, but Jennifer was just getting started. You see, Mr. Hayes, what you don't understand is that Hallie signed a very comprehensive contract. One that includes moral clauses about the surrogate's behavior during pregnancy. Jennifer pulled out a tablet, swiping to a document. Specifically, clauses about engaging in romantic relationships that could compromise the child's welfare. Hallie felt the blood drain from her face. That's not, we didn't. Didn't what? Engage in a sexual relationship while carrying our biological child. Jennifer's voice was silk over steel. Because I have photos suggesting otherwise. She turned the tablet toward them, revealing the same farmer's market photo that had been delivered to Richard's office, along with others. Richard and Hallie holding hands outside the doctor's office, Richard's arm around her shoulders as they walked David to school. The moment 3 nights ago when Richard had kissed her goodnight on the front porch. "You've been watching us," Richard said, his voice dangerous. "Protecting our interests," Jennifer corrected. "And now we're prepared to exercise our legal rights to reclaim our child." "Your child?" Hallie's voice cracked with fury and pain. "You abandoned us. You called her defective because she wasn't a boy. We called the arrangement unsuitable because you violated your contract. But we've secured new legal counsel, and they assure us that your moral lapses void any claims you might have to custody." Hallie felt the room spinning. Everything good that had happened in the past month was being twisted into weapons against her. "She's not your child anymore," Richard said, stepping forward. "You terminated the contract. You walked away. We terminated financial support due to breach of contract. We never relinquished parental rights." Jennifer's smile was triumphant. "Our daughter will be raised in a proper home, by proper parents who can provide stability without the complications of this situation." "Complications?" Hallie's voice rose, months of suppressed rage finally finding its target. "You mean the complication of me being black? Of me having a mother in prison? Of me not being grateful enough for your crumbs? I mean the complication of you being exactly what we should have expected. A young woman who got pregnant by a stranger for money and then tried to use that pregnancy to trap a wealthy man." The words hit Hallie like physical blows. Every fear she'd ever had about how the world saw her, every cruel assumption she'd fought against her entire life, was being weaponized by this woman who'd never struggled a day in her privileged existence. "Get out!" Richard's voice was deadly quiet. "Excuse me? Get out of my house before I have you arrested for harassment and stalking." Jennifer's composure cracked slightly. "You can't intimidate us, Mr. Hayes. We have legal standing and photographic evidence of moral violations. That child belongs with us." "That child," Hallie said, finding her voice again, "has a name. Her name is Hope, and she belongs with people who love her, not people who collect children like trophies." "Love?" Jennifer laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "You think this is love? You think a man like Richard Hayes would choose someone like you if you weren't carrying his meal ticket?" The words found their mark. Hallie had wondered the same thing in her darkest moments, whether Richard was motivated by guilt, by pity, by some white savior complex rather than genuine feeling. "That's not true," Richard said, but Jennifer wasn't finished. "Really? Then tell me, Mr. Hayes, what happens when the novelty wears off? When your board threatens your position? When your high society mother learns her son is playing house with the help?" Jennifer's smile was poison. "How long before you realize you can have any woman you want? Women from your own world. Women who won't embarrass you at country club dinners. And this little fantasy becomes inconvenient." Hallie felt every word like a knife. Because underneath the cruelty, Jennifer was voicing every fear that kept Hallie awake at night. "Stop," Richard said, but the damage was spreading. "I've done my research, Mr. Hayes. Your late wife was a doctor from a prominent family. Educated, accomplished, socially appropriate. Now you're slumming with a surrogate whose mother is a convicted felon." Jennifer's voice turned venomous. "How long before you wake up and realize you're sabotaging your son's future for a piece of?" "Get out!" Richard roared, his control finally snapping. "Get out now, before I do something we'll both regret." Jennifer gathered her things with satisfied composure. "You have 48 hours to end this arrangement voluntarily, or we'll see you in court. And trust me, we'll win. Because judges don't award children to unwed mothers with criminal families and questionable morals, especially when there are stable, married couples ready to provide proper homes. The door slammed behind Jennifer, leaving Richard and Hallie standing in the sudden silence, both of them reeling from the attack. "She's right," Hallie whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's not." "She is." Hallie turned on him, tears streaming down her face. "About all of it. Your board is watching you. Your reputation is at stake. David's future could be affected." Her voice cracked. "And I am just a surrogate with a criminal mother who's been living in a fantasy." "Hallie, don't do this." "Do what?" "Face reality." She laughed bitterly. "I've been playing house with a man so far out of my league that it's laughable. I've been pretending that fairy tales happen to girls like me." "This isn't a fairy tale," Richard said desperately. "This is real. What we feel is real." "Is it? Or are you just a grieving widower who saw a broken girl and decided to play hero?" The words tore from her throat like physical pain. "Maybe Jennifer's right. Maybe you're slumming until you come to your senses." Richard felt like he'd been slapped. "How can you say that? After everything?" "Because it's what makes sense." Hallie was crying harder now, months of suppressed fear and insecurity pouring out. "Rich white men don't fall in love with poor black girls carrying other people's babies. They don't risk their empires for women they've known 3 weeks. I would risk everything for you. You shouldn't have to." The words exploded from her with devastating finality. "You shouldn't have to choose between your world and me, because you'll regret choosing me. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but eventually. And David will pay the price, and Hope will pay the price, and I'll be exactly what everyone expects me to be. The mistake you made when you were lonely." Richard stared at her, seeing the woman he was falling in love with disappearing behind walls of hurt and self-protection. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we should end this before it gets worse." Hallie's voice was hollow now, drained of everything except resignation. "Maybe I should take Hope and disappear before your world tears us all apart." "And go where?" "Do what?" "I don't know." The admission broke from her like a sob. "But at least I'll fail on my own terms instead of dragging you down with me." Richard felt panic rising in his chest. "Hallie, please." "I need to pack," she said, turning toward the house. "I need to get out of here before I make this harder than it already is." She walked away from him, leaving Richard standing alone in Rebecca's garden, watching the woman he loved disappear into the house where they'd been building a future that suddenly felt as fragile as spring flowers in a killing frost. Inside, Hallie leaned against her bedroom door, one hand on her belly where Hope was kicking frantically, as if sensing the upheaval. "I'm sorry, baby girl," she whispered. "Mama thought we'd found our family, but some dreams are too big for girls like us." 2 doors down, David slept peacefully, unaware that the happiness he'd rediscovered was about to shatter. And in the garden, Richard stood among Rebecca's roses, feeling like he was losing everything that mattered all over again. Except this time, he had the power to stop it. The question was whether love was worth fighting for when the whole world seemed determined to tear it apart. The shatter point had arrived, and everything hung in the balance. Richard stood in Rebecca's garden until dawn, her voice echoing in his memory from their last real conversation before the accident. "Promise me something, Rich. If something happens to me, don't let fear make you small. Don't let other people's limitations become your cage. David needs to see what it looks like when someone fights for love." The memory hit him like lightning. Rebecca hadn't just been talking about grief. She'd been talking about courage. About choosing love over safety, authenticity over approval. When the sun finally crested the horizon, Richard knew what he had to do. Hallie hadn't slept. She'd spent the night packing her few belongings and researching homeless shelters with maternity programs. Her savings would last exactly 9 days. After that, She and Hope would be completely dependent on charity, the very thing she'd fought her whole life to avoid. But staying meant watching Richard's world crumble piece by piece. It meant seeing David lose the father he was just getting back. It meant being the reason a good man destroyed himself for an impossible dream. A soft knock interrupted her spiral of self-recrimination. "Hallie." David's voice was small through the door. "Are you really leaving?" She opened the door to find him standing in his pajamas, clutching the stuffed elephant that had belonged to his mother. His eyes were red-rimmed, and her heart shattered all over again. "Come here, sweetheart." She knelt down carefully, pulling him into a hug that felt like goodbye. "Daddy's been crying," David whispered against her shoulder. "I heard him on the phone with Grandma. She was saying mean things about you." Hallie closed her eyes, the confirmation hitting like a physical blow. Of course Richard's family was involved now. Of course they were mobilizing against the threat she represented. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices," she said gently. "It doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. But you make Daddy happy, and Hope needs her big brother." David pulled back to look at her with Rebecca's intelligent eyes. "Mommy always said family isn't just blood. She said family is who chooses to love you every day." Downstairs, Richard was making calls. Not to lawyers or board members or damage control specialists, but to the people whose opinions actually mattered. "Morrison Industries can survive a scandal," he said into the phone, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised him. "What it can't survive is being run by someone who's forgotten what matters." His assistant's voice was strained. "Sir, the board is threatening an emergency vote of no confidence." "Then let them vote. I built this company from nothing once. I can do it again if I have to." Richard looked up at the ceiling, where he could hear Hallie moving around, probably packing. "But I won't sacrifice my family for their comfort." "Your family, sir?" "The woman upstairs is carrying my daughter," Richard said clearly. "The woman upstairs is going to be my wife, if she'll have me. And if the board can't handle that, they can find a new CEO." The silence on the other end was deafening. Richard could practically hear his assistant recalibrating everything she thought she knew about him. Should I schedule a press conference?" "No," Richard said, a plan crystallizing in his mind. "Schedule something better." Hallie's moment of truth. Hallie was closing her suitcase when she heard voices from the garden. Richard on the phone, his tone carrying across the morning air. "I don't care what the social implications are, Mother. I don't care if your friends at the country club have opinions. I care about the woman I love and the family we're building." Hallie moved to the window, her heart hammering as she listened. "No, I'm not having a breakdown. I'm having a breakthrough. For 2 years, I've been sleepwalking through my life, honoring Rebecca's memory by becoming a ghost myself. But love isn't supposed to be a museum piece. It's supposed to be living, breathing, growing." Richard's voice grew stronger, more certain. "Hallie makes me want to be the man Rebecca believed I could be. She makes David laugh again. She makes this house feel like home instead of a mausoleum. And if loving her costs me everything else, then everything else wasn't worth having." Hallie pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. No one had ever fought for her like this. No one had ever chosen her over safety, over convention, over the easy path. Hope kicked frantically, as if sensing the emotional upheaval, and Hallie whispered, "He's fighting for us, baby girl. Someone's finally fighting for us." An hour later, Richard found Hallie still sitting by the window, her suitcase closed but not moved. "Going somewhere?" he asked gently. "I was. I thought I should." She looked up at him with eyes that held love and terror in equal measure. "But then I heard you on the phone." "Ah." Richard sat beside her on the window seat. "How much did you hear?" "Enough to know you're about to lose everything for me. I'm about to gain everything that matters." Richard took her hands, his grip firm and certain. Hallie, I've made my choice. The question is, what's yours? Before she could answer, David appeared in the doorway, still clutching his elephant. Are we still a family? He asked with devastating directness. Hallie and Richard looked at each other, then at the little boy who'd somehow become the center of their world. That depends, Richard said carefully, on whether Miss Hallie wants to be part of our family officially. David's face lit up with understanding. Like married, Richard confirmed, never taking his eyes off Hallie's face. The proposal. Richard, Hallie breathed. You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything. Richard slid off the window seat and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in both of his. I know this is fast. I know it's complicated. I know the world will have opinions. It's not that. I know you're scared. I know you think I'll wake up and regret choosing you over convention. But Hallie, his voice broke slightly, I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of losing everything else combined. David crept closer, his excitement palpable. Are you going to ask her the question, Daddy? What question? Hallie whispered, though her heart was already racing toward the answer. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, elegant ring. Not the massive diamond his world would expect, but a delicate band set with stones that caught the morning light like captured stars. Hallie Williams, he said, his voice steady and sure. Will you marry me? Will you let me be Hope's father and David's stepmother's husband and the luckiest man alive? The question hung in the air between them, enormous with possibility. Hallie looked at Richard, this man who'd seen her at her lowest point and decided she was worth fighting for. Then at David, whose face was bright with hope, then down at her belly where their daughter was dancing with what felt like celebration. The board will destroy you, she whispered. Let them try. Your family will disown you. You'll be my family. People will say a lot of things. But Hope will know her parents chose each other deliberately, courageously, completely. Richard's eyes were blazing with conviction. She'll know that love is worth fighting for. Hallie felt the last of her walls crumbling. What if I'm not strong enough for your world? You survived 8 months of carrying a child for people who abandoned you. You're working toward a chemistry degree while pregnant and homeless. You count coins for baby formula and still say thank you with grace. Richard's voice was fierce with admiration. You're the strongest person I know. My world should be grateful to have you. Hope delivered a powerful kick directly against Hallie's ribs, and she laughed through her tears. I think that's a yes from Hope, David announced solemnly. What about from Hope's mama? Richard asked softly. Hallie looked at this man who'd turned her life upside down in the most beautiful way possible, who'd seen her worth when she'd forgotten it herself, who was willing to risk everything for a love that had blindsided them both. Yes, she whispered, and the word felt like coming home. Yes to all of it. Richard slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and when David cheered, the sound filled the house with joy that had been missing for too long. They were engaged. They were family, and the forces trying to tear them apart were about to discover that some loves were strong enough to weather any storm. Love often requires us to be braver than we ever thought possible. What's the most courageous thing you've ever done for love? Share your story in the comments. We believe in the power of love that fights back. The choice had been made. Now came the battle to defend it. But as Richard kissed his fiancée while their children, born and unborn, celebrated around them, he felt Rebecca's presence like a blessing, as if she were whispering, Asterisk, this is what I wanted for you. This is what fighting for love looks like. Asterisk. The hardest tests still lay ahead, but they would face them together. 6 months later, the courthouse steps were bathed in golden autumn sunlight as Hallie Hayes, She still felt a thrill every time she thought her new name, adjusted her ivory dress around her 4-month-old daughter. Hope gurgled contentedly in her arms, her dark eyes bright with the curiosity that seemed to define her personality. "Ready, Mrs. Hayes?" Richard asked, his arm sliding around Hallie's waist as photographers captured their emergence from the final custody hearing. "More than ready, Mr. Hayes." The legal battle had been brutal. 3 months of depositions, character witnesses, and media scrutiny that would have destroyed a weaker love. But it had also been clarifying. Every attack had only proven how strong their foundation was, how right their choice had been. Jennifer and Robert Henderson had thrown everything they had at Richard and Hallie. Private investigators, media leaks, even attempts to have Richard removed from Morrison Industries' board. But they'd underestimated the power of a man who'd found his purpose and a woman who'd discovered her worth. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," a reporter called out, "how does it feel to have full custody officially confirmed?" Richard looked down at Hope, who was reaching for his tie with tiny, determined fingers. "It feels like justice," he said simply. "This little girl has always belonged with people who love her unconditionally." The courthouse victory was just the final piece of a transformation that had been building for months. Morrison Industries hadn't collapsed when Richard chose love over convention. Instead, it had thrived under his newfound clarity of purpose. The affordable housing initiative he'd launched in Hallie's honor was being hailed as revolutionary corporate responsibility. "Daddy, Mama," David's voice carried across the courthouse plaza as he ran toward them, his school uniform slightly wrinkled from the excitement of being picked up early for the celebration. David had taken to calling Hallie Mama 3 months ago, the title emerging naturally during a bedtime story. When Hallie had protested that she wasn't trying to replace Rebecca, David had looked at her with 7-year-old wisdom and said, "Mommy was my first mama. You're my now mama. Hope needs both of us." The simple logic had made both adults cry, and from that moment, their family unit had felt complete in ways none of them had expected. "How did it go?" David asked, though his face was already bright with anticipation. "Hope is officially ours forever," Hallie said, and David's cheer attracted smiles from passing strangers. "Can we get ice cream to celebrate?" "We can do better than that," Richard said, exchanging a loaded glance with Hallie. "We can go home and show Hope her surprise." Home was the renovated farmhouse 40 minutes outside the city. Close enough for Richard's commute, far enough to give them privacy and space to grow. Hallie had chosen it because it had room for gardens and laboratories, because David could have a treehouse, because Hope would grow up with space to run and dream. As they pulled into the circular driveway, David pressed his face against the window. "Is it finished? Can we see it?" "It's finished," Hallie confirmed, her heart full to bursting. The surprise was Hope's nursery, not the elegant designer space from the old house, but a room Hallie and Richard had planned together. Soft yellow walls painted with a mural of a little girl reaching for stars, bookshelves already filled with stories about brave princesses and brilliant scientists. A window seat where Hallie could nurse while watching David play in the yard below. But the centerpiece was what made David gasp with delight. A mobile hanging over the crib, each piece handcrafted by Richard during late nights when he couldn't sleep. Tiny figures representing their family. A little boy with a book, a woman in a lab coat, a man in a business suit, and at the center, a baby girl with arms stretched wide as if embracing the whole world. "It's perfect," Hallie whispered, tears threatening again. "It's ours," Richard corrected, and the word carried the weight of everything they'd fought to protect. That evening, they established a new tradition. David read Hope a story, something about a brave little girl who saved her kingdom through cleverness and kindness. while Hallie and Richard prepared dinner together in the kitchen that had become the heart of their home. "Any regrets?" Hallie asked as she watched Richard efficiently dice vegetables with techniques Rebecca had taught him. "About what?" "Morrison Industries stock dropped 12% when our engagement was announced. Your mother still won't return your calls. Half your social circle acts like you've lost your mind." Richard paused in his chopping, considering the question seriously. "You want to know what I regret? Tell me." "I regret that it took me 2 years to find you. I regret that you spent even one night counting coins for formula. I regret that Hope's first months were marked by stress instead of celebration." He set down the knife and turned to face her fully. "But marrying you? Fighting for our family? Choosing love over everyone else's comfort? Not for a single second." Hope began fussing from a bouncy seat, and both parents moved toward her simultaneously, a dance they'd perfected over the past months. Richard lifted her while Hallie prepared a bottle, their movements synchronized by practice and instinct. "She's getting so big," Richard marveled, settling into the rocking chair with Hope against his chest. "Dr. Martinez says she's in the 95th percentile for everything. Height, weight, cognitive development." Hallie's pride was evident. Apparently, babies thrive when they're wanted. "Of course she's brilliant," Richard said, offering Hope her bottle. "Look at her parents." As if summoned by the word parents, David appeared in the kitchen doorway, homework in hand, but his attention focused entirely on his baby sister. "Can I help feed her?" he asked, the same question he'd asked every evening for 3 months. "Always," Hallie said, making room on the couch for David to settle beside Richard. The sight never got old, her husband holding their daughter while their son helped with the bottle, all of them gathered in the warm kitchen light. It was exactly what she'd dreamed family could be, but never believed she deserved. "Miss Hallie, I mean Mama," David said carefully. He was still adjusting to the new title. "When Hope gets bigger, can we teach her about Mommy Rebecca too?" The question could have been painful, but instead it felt like healing. "Of course we can. She was part of our family's story." "Good," David said with satisfaction. "Because Mommy would have loved Hope. She always said babies were miracles, and Hope is definitely a miracle." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. "She definitely is." Later, after David finished homework and Hope was fed and content, the family settled into their evening routine. David read aloud from his chapter book while Hope lay on her play mat, fascinated by the colorful toys Richard had hung just within reach. Hallie graded chemistry labs on her laptop. She'd returned to school part-time, with Richard's support and a schedule built around Hope's needs. "Listen to this part," David said excitedly, reading from his book. "The princess realized she didn't need anyone to save her, but having someone choose to stand beside her made everything better." Hallie and Richard exchanged glances over David's head, both thinking the same thing. Sometimes children understood love better than adults. "That's a smart princess," Hallie said. "Like you," David announced matter-of-factly, then continued reading. When bedtime came, they moved through their routine with practiced ease. David brushed his teeth, while Hallie changed Hope into pajamas, Richard reading emails that could wait until tomorrow because family time was sacred now. "Daddy," David said as Richard tucked him in, "are you happy now?" The question was simple, but the answer felt profound. Richard looked around the room, at David's drawings on the walls, at the baby monitor connecting them to Hope's nursery, at Hallie standing in the doorway with their daughter in her arms, and felt peace settle in his chest. "I'm more than happy, buddy. I'm home." David grinned. "Good. Because tomorrow I want to teach Hope about dinosaurs, and she needs happy parents to learn properly." "That's exactly how it works," Hallie laughed. settling beside Richard on the bed for their nightly story. As they read together, David following along, Hope drowsing against Hallie's chest, Richard's arm around both his girls. The scene echoed that first moment in the pharmacy when everything had changed. "You know what I realized today?" Hallie said later as they settled Hope into her crib. "What's that?" "6 months ago, I was counting coins for formula, thinking I was completely alone in the world." She looked up at Richard with eyes that held joy instead of desperation. "Tonight, I'm tucking our daughter into a nursery we designed together, in a house filled with love, married to a man who chose our family over everything else his world offered." Richard pulled her close, both of them looking down at Hope, who slept with the profound peace of a baby who knew she was cherished. "What changed?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "You saw me," Hallie said simply. "Really saw me. Not what I lacked or what I needed, but who I was and who I could become." She turned in his arms to face him. "You saw worth where everyone else saw problems." "I saw the woman I was meant to love," Richard corrected, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I saw my family, even when I didn't know that's what I was looking for." Hope stirred in her sleep, and both parents instinctively moved closer to the crib, their hands meeting on the rail as they watched their daughter dream. "Do you think she knows?" Hallie whispered. "How much she changed everything." "She will," Richard promised. "We'll tell her every day how she brought us together, how she made us brave enough to choose love over fear." They stood in the soft glow of the nightlight, watching Hope sleep, listening to David's peaceful breathing through the baby monitor, surrounded by the family they'd built from impossible circumstances and unwavering faith. "I love you," Hallie said, the words still feeling miraculous on her tongue. "I love you too," Richard replied, and the promise felt as solid as the home they'd created, as lasting as the hope they'd named their daughter for. 6 months ago, a young woman had counted coins for baby formula, believing she had nothing left to lose. Tonight, that same woman was tucked safely in the arms of a man who'd risked everything to love her, surrounded by children who called her Mama, in a house that proved fairy tales could come true when hearts were brave enough to believe in them. The story had come full circle, from desperation to hope, from isolation to belonging, from counting coins to building dreams. And tomorrow would bring new adventures for the Hayes family, built on the foundation that love, real love, was worth any fight required to protect it. Hope stirred once more, and both her parents smiled, knowing that their daughter would grow up understanding that love wasn't something you hoped for. It was something you fought for, something you chose every day, something that transformed ordinary moments into miracles. The circle was complete. The family was whole. And love had won, as it always did when hearts were brave enough to let it.